So we'd like to dedicate this year to Tony Shweka and Chana, my daughter, on the birth of a newborn. Well, if it's a birth, it's a newborn.
You need this.
Boy.
You need this.
Okay. Baruch Hashem, Yom Yom. Okay, now we come to this very, very interesting and difficult story. Short, 26 psukim, but very, very difficult to understand. In going over the commentary in Ferush that I wrote, it's already 15, 20 years ago, and going it over now, I was at the Kayin and Hevel section, and indeed I changed the title. Instead of saying Kayin and Hevel, that's what I said before, I changed it to Kayin / Hevel. And as this talk progresses, you will see why I did that. When you see why I did that, you'll understand the whole thrust of this talk. So I changed it from Kayin and Hevel to Kayin / Hevel. Okay, now in general, the question is, the fact is, in the story, Kain kills Habil. The question is, how are we to understand the word, the killing? What does killing mean? Now, in English usage, in normal circumstance, like we're not talking about a war or something like that, when we say kill, we mean murder. That's the colloquial usage of the language. If you say kill without any explanation, it generally carries the notion of murdering somebody. Okay. We're not interested now in the law, which deals with first and second degree and so on, and manslaughter and different stages or subtleties in the law. However, in English it means to kill in the sense of murder. But in this story, that's one of the questions. He killed, but is the killing murder or not? So therefore, one has to be very careful on the language one uses. So I use the word destroy. Instead of saying killed, I use the word destroyed. Or the usual word they talk about here is slew. He slew him. S-L-E-W. Okay. Now, what's interesting is we're going on the assumption Kain killed Hevel, and the general opinion has been for the longest time that this was murder. Murder. Oh, not any other type of killing, whatever there is. Even for some people, the only other type of killing there is really in a war. But as we'll see later, there are other types which can be carried by the same word. But lo and behold, the word that's used in the text is harag. Haragta. He met Kain, he said something, we'll talk about that later, and he went out to meet, he rose up and met Habil in the field, and he killed him. Vayargehu, and he killed him. So the first question is, the word for murder in Hebrew, biblical Hebrew, is ratzeach. So usually the rule is in Hebrew, in biblical Hebrew, that when you introduce a topic and you introduce the language of that topic, usually there's some explanation on the spot and not at a later point. That's the way the thing works. If you introduce a word, for example, that wasn't used before, then there'll be the next sentence will give you some intimation of what the word it means. Okay, so the first question is, why doesn't it say retzach? That's the word for murder. Okay. The answer is that the term retzach is a legal term. The first place it occurs is in the Aseret HaDibrot, the Ten Commandments. We're in Breshit, the beginning. And in Noah's story, in one of the chapters, it says that you shouldn't kill, he'll kill somebody, we have to give him capital punishment. So, in places other than a legal context, the first being Aseret HaDibrot in the middle of Shemot, the word Retzach is not used. The word Harag is the basic term. Okay? So that answers the question here. This is not a legal context. It's not a legal context. So even though it's the first time that we have this type of an event, this type of an action of murdering, which could be reasonable cause for exception to the general rule, that is, even though this is not a legal context, it should, as the first, carry the notion of Retzach. Okay, we bypassed that, but the basic point is that it's carried by the word Harag. Okay? Now, the next, you watch any TV program? What's the motive? We got all the forensics now, we got all these TV programs showing you all the forensics, and we're searching for motive. You can't have murder without a motive. So what's the motive? Well, it happens to be that the story goes, it has an opening pasuk about Chava and Âdem, who gave birth to Kayin. We'll come back to that first pasuk. And then, right after that, it says a little story about Kain was a farmer, and Hevel was a shepherd. Okay? And they each brought offerings, called a mincha. Not important for the moment what it is. We'll talk about it a little bit later. But they all, each one of them brought an offering to Hashem. And the next pasuk says that Hevel's was accepted and Kain's was not accepted. No reason is given. There's no reason in the text why one is accepted and the other isn't. There have been speculations about the quality of the korban, or the quality of the offering, that when you're dealing with the grain offering, which is mincha, the offering that they gave, that's at a lower order than if you give an animal, or you give a cow, or something like that, or a sheep. But what does that have to do with anything? If the guy's a farmer and he doesn't, and not a shepherd, so he gives the best of his crop. And the pasuk emphasizes in the text, you can read it for yourself. After the pre-hadamah, the fruit of his toil and labor came to an end where he had to harvest. He gave the best, whatever it is. Okay, so motive. So the pasuk right after the few lines on the story Hashem says to Kain, if you will do good, you'll be okay. But meaning that somehow there was something wrong with Kain's korban. From the point of view of Hashem telling him, look, if you'll do good, you'll improve, you'll be okay. So it's implied from that there was something wrong with Kain's korban, even though the text doesn't say anything. Okay, so what's the motive? Oh, we got a motive. Jealousy. Kain was jealous of Hevel, whose korban or his offering was accepted, and his wasn't. So the question, or the assumption, one, that there was murder, and two, that murder needs a motive, gave a thrust, an intimation as to the meaning of that story in there about one being a shepherd and one being a farmer. In other words, that now took on a meaningfulness in terms of the overall point that's being built up. That was the motive. The motive was jealousy. And how do we know? Because the word for jealousy is kin'ah, and Kain's name has the same letters, and so, by association, one could say it's not unreasonable that Kain's name includes this jealousy, and indeed jealousy was the motive for killing him, even though it's not mentioned in the text. So it's inferred from the way we're setting up the development of the story. Okay.
That's computer?
I don't know what that is. In any event, there's no jealousy in the story. There's no mention of that. If it would have said right away, if the text was to give you the motivation, there would be no question here. The text would tell you that's the end of the story. What are you raising questions? You're doing psychoanalysis on the situation? There's nothing to talk about. But the text doesn't say. It leaves it open. Okay. Then it says in this famous pasuk, Kain rose up and he said, and he killed Hevel, his brother. Well, very unusual. Usually in the Chumash, in the text, when somebody says, and somebody said something, they tell you what he said. Over here, he said, but there's nothing, nothing. Vayomer Kayin and Hevel, Achiv. And Kyle said to Hevel, his brother, Vahi b'yosam basadeh, when they were in the field, Vayokam Kayin el Hevel echav v'yagu. So, we know if you have the phrase Amar Balibo, that he said in his heart, like you thought it in your mind, but you didn't externalize it in words. That in the Chumash it's not popular, but it's carried by the word Amar. Amar could mean he thought. Vayomer, he thought, in the sense that he thought to himself, or he thought that's what he's going to do, but he didn't verbalize anything. So that could be implicit in this pasuk of Vayomer, and he said, without saying what he said. Very unusual, but not totally unreasonable in the context. Okay, so here we have Kain says something, but what is said is not stated. Now we're going to come back to all these points after we finish the first part of this clarification of the story. So we're going along generally with the flow of the story as it's been taken to be. And these points will come back. It also mentions Echav twice in the pasuk, his brother. It also mentions Echav twice. Again, these are subtle things that we'll pick up later. Okay, the third point. If it's murder, where's the death penalty? No matter what you want to say, somewhere in the story there should be some indication of a punishment, and as stated in the Noach chapter 8, whatever it says there, that the person in the Torah system there is such a thing called the death penalty for murder. Okay? So in this story there's no death penalty. Again, a big derogation, if it's left like that, and it's murder, well, the reader cannot but walk away by saying, look, either the text contradicts itself, or it has degraded the very principle of capital punishment, which is intrinsic to the Torah system. But, indeed, there's no death penalty. Okay. What's Bimkom? He gets a punishment. Because later, as the story develops, Hashem comes to him after this, and after he says he killed him, he comes to him and says, where's your brother? Again, brother, where's your brother? His blood cries to me from the earth, and so will you killed him, and so on. Where is your brother? Do you know where he is? Well, Kain just killed him. He should be where he killed him. I mean, he didn't take him and bury him. He just left him there, whatever it was. Okay, so in the ensuing little dialogue, interchange between Kain and Hashem, what we see is that Kain, in certain things, he doesn't answer in a number of places. He doesn't answer the questions. He keeps silent. And he says the famous words, am I my brother's keeper? Okay. Well, how do we take that? on the line that we're developing now, the storyline, he's like playing with Hashem. What do you mean? What kind of thing is that? It's your brother. It's not somebody off the street, even that's bad enough, but this is your brother you killed. So, I mean, to say you didn't know, ani lo yadati, the language, I didn't know that I'm supposed to watch over my brother. Shomer, to take care of him. Okay? And certainly not to kill him. To have proper behavior. Okay? So, in that little interchange, there are some subtle points. Again, the word achav, his brother, is mentioned 2 or 3 times. And he gives you this famous line, I'm on my brother's keeper, which cannot but be interpreted as playing a game. Or trying to fool. I mean, what? He's trying to fool Hashem? It's odd, to say the least. But we leave that open. Okay? But there is a punishment for this behavior. Because later in the story, Kain himself refers to it as a avon, as an aveira, as a sin, as a wrongdoing. So we see that even from his own point of view, in talking to HaKadosh Baruch Hu and so forth, he says, my avon, my wrongdoing is worse, in effect, is worse than the death penalty. What's worse than the death penalty? Well, the death penalty is bad enough. But what's worse is living in pre-civil society. Living in an area as a nomad, with no social structure. What in the tradition was called man in a state of nature, for Hobbes, which was a war of all against all, or each against each. There was not sufficient organization, societal organization, so that one individual could protect another, could have a contract with another. Each one was on his own, and just by pure randomness would be taken and be killed. So Kain says, my punishment, I was banished, he says. He was, that's what the text says. He was banished to Nod. Now in that time, not like today, at that time there were areas which functioned like pre-civil society. You could have big areas where nobody is living there and you're a nomad, Navanad, wander around and so forth, no fixity, or not sufficient fixity of social structure, so that we would call it pre-civil society. So the punishment turned out to be that he was put into this special place called Nod, and what was he supposed to do? He was supposed to live there, but he was supposed to make civil this place. He was supposed to civilize it, to make it into a kind of a society. But as it stood in the beginning, he was feared for his life. He says, I'm going to be over there, I'm going to live in this place. Well, somebody's going to kill me. Just like this. So that's, and if I said, I'd rather have the death penalty. I mean, I don't want to be living my life in anxiety of being killed by somebody off the street. No streets, a nomadic existence. Okay, so there's no death penalty, but there is a punishment, which he took as a punishment, because he puts it in his own words, of having to live in a pre-civil society-like existence. And as after this interchange, and he lives in this land, an indication of what's going on is that there's a small genealogy in this story. The first part, up to chapter point 7, verse 17, 1 to 17, deals with the Kain and the murder. And then from 18 to 26, there's a small genealogy of Kain. What the genealogy is carried, we'll talk about it later, but the genealogy in the Chumash is carried by individuals and individual names which, when they are analyzed linguistically, turn out to be the cultural characteristics of the time we're talking about. We're talking now about the generations from Âdem to Noach, which is in chapter 5. We'll come to it at the end. This is chapter 4 we're talking about in Kain. But these names, when analyzed through, turn out to be the social, cultural characteristics. So when they began to, somebody's name is Chanoch, so that means not that there was a guy, an individual named Chanoch who had a son and so on and so on. Chanoch means education, and so there was a period when education started to come in as a serious thing. When you're building a civil society, you have to educate. So and then there was somebody who had a name with Matu, Methuselah, and this one and that one. And when you analyze the names through, they turn out to be socio-cultural characteristics. When they started to bury the dead, when they started schooling, when they started protection of the people by a military thing. So the names in the text are crucial and fundamental and have been missed, unfortunately, by most of the Meforshim. For whatever the reason, they did not analyze the names in terms of what they really represent. The names are not names of individual people per se. Now, in the traditions around this area, a lot of these were taken as gods, as divinities. So, indeed, they had a name, and the name would carry this divinity and so on. And indeed, some of those divinities carried socio-cultural functions. Okay, but so I'm not arguing about that. That could very well be the case. But in the text as we have it, one has to understand that these names, and indeed all the names of people, of places in the Chumash text carry packages, big packages of information, without which, if you do not catch the information and you don't understand the context of a story or a narrative in which those names are operative. So, in addition to the Chumash giving names, like Moshe, he was pulled out of the water, and so each name in the Chumash deserves its linguistic analysis in its own terms, aside from the way it's done, and some names are explained actually in the Chumash text. And I know for the first time when I did it, wow, I thought I'm getting bugged. I mean, I read it, Chanoch gave birth to this one, so this guy gave birth to that one, this one, so on, so on. And I read on the topic, in the ancient Near East, some of these early people, progenitors lived for thousands of years. And when we're talking here about somebody living 350 years or 700 years, that's peanuts compared to they were in the thousands of years. Because this was a kind of a cosmogony, and that was part of the picture. So I took it, okay, Torah is a great thing. It says individuals, this guy gave birth to this guy, this guy gave birth to this guy. And giving birth, nolad, means in the context that we're talking about now, developments, events that happen. Those are what we're talking about. Okay, so I remember the first time I did it, I go for a walk, and it was unbelievable. It was an eye-opener for the first time to see what these things were all about. Okay, we'll return to that a little later. But the basic point is, he was punished. So he took something as a punishment, which was this living a life of nomad, which is what we would call pre-civil society type existence. Okay, and so in this pasuk, Hashem gave him a sign. Whatever that is not said explicitly, but at least there was the proposition, the sign being a statement that he knew that he won't get killed. He's going to build up this pre-civil society state into a society where there's a genealogy, and then there's development and city and all the rest. Somebody was Erod, he built the city and so forth, and you look at that little genealogy, which we'll return to later. You look at it, has 3 or 4 names in it, and it's telling you about metallurgy and musical instruments and so forth. And so that's the picture. So that's indicative of what's happening to Kain after the killing of Hevel, after his being banned from civilization into Nod, and as he begins to redevelop it into civil society. Okay. This in general is the picture of the story that makes coherent. It explained the business about the shepherd and the farmer. Okay. Incidentally, as you know, there always was a battle between shepherd and farmer in terms of water and so forth, which is not to the point now. It has a separate in that. Okay, so this is generally the case. Now we come back to say, okay, the word harag is what the word is used here. The word harag we took in this discussion so far that its primary meaning is to kill somebody. That's not the case. Harag, linguistically, is not that you killed somebody. That's indeed one of the subsets of this word. But linguistically, harag means not to kill. As I put it here, killing, destroying is not the primary meaning of harag. It is the subject of a disorganizing movement. Linguistically, har, break up into two syllables. Har, rag. Okay? Har is that which is strong, robust, powerful. Rag, Reish Gimel, characterizes every kind of movement in the organs, emotion, commotion, disorganization. In other words, the meaning of the term that's used here is not going according to the assumption that I gave right in the beginning, that the basic meaning of harag is to kill someone. In the dictionary of biblical terms that I use, it's not even mentioned. As an example, the word death or killing does not appear in the dictionary entry. What appears is this whole thing here, a kind of movement in the organs, emotion, commotion, disorganization, which now, from the linguistic point of view, starts to make a big dent in the previous interpretation. If harag meant to kill, then okay, this is what comes through, and it's been for a number of long centuries, a couple of thousand years, taken as the general shot, gives a coherent picture of the story, and that's the story. It's the first murder in society or in existence, and that's being marked by this story. But since harag is harag meaning murder or killing is a secondary meaning under a larger umbrella, now this opens the question, maybe there's some kind of thing which is called killing, which fits under the meaning of harag, but is not murder. Ho ho! There is such a thing. Aside from milchama, which we're not, this is not a milchama context.
It's the first murder, is the first death also?
The first murder, yeah.
This is the first death?
Yeah.
So that people know they could die?
Well, that's part of the Gan Eden story and the whole business. That if you eat from the Eitz Hadas Tovara, you'll die, and what does that mean? And so, whatever it is, but it's irrelevant here.
If you kill them or not.
Okay, let's put it this way, you have to hold it, because that question is irrelevant to this story. It has its place in the second, third chapter when we talk about death, talk about the busha, of shame, modesty, and there are a number of topics there in the man-woman relation, how Chava was made, and so on. So there are a number of 6 or 7 fundamental topics in that big chunk of chapter 2 and 3, one of which is to talk about the death, but it's totally irrelevant here. Well, here we're talking about this idea of the killing. Okay, so now a very important switch opens up when we take this meaning of haram. If we don't take it this way, and unfortunately it has not been taken this way, and therefore we take it as a killing as the primary meaning, over here is something else. But now what else? When a psychopath kills somebody, in certain cases of psychic behavior, psychosis, psychic behavior, when the person has lost control after a certain level, even in the law, there's a mitigation, and it's not called murder. When somebody in a psychic state, psychotic state, does kill somebody, it's not necessarily considered murder. Different societies have different rules, but it's coming. Why is it not murder? Because there's no motive. The motive is coming in from the, we'll get to it right away, from the seichel, from the cognitive dimension of the person. He says, I want this money, I want this, I'm jealousy, and so on and so on. The cognitive development of the person provides the motive. But here, the person is mentally ill and has no workability of that cognition, so that the act is done and caused by this behavior, state of behavior, but it's not exactly the same thing as what we call murder. But it falls under the definition of harag, which is the big point here that gives the transition. So it falls under the meaning of harag, which shows that the text is not using the word retzach. If it's not talking about murder, it chose the right word. It chose the word harag, because harag relates to somebody like that. That's one case. The second case is, in certain meditative states, a person can tap into the life, what I call the life energy dimension, the life energy field of a person, such that the cognition, the cognitive aspect of the person, which keeps the life energy, and we'll get to that right away, the life energy in bound, the bounding of the life energy comes in from the cognitive point of, from the cognition of the person. But in meditative states, and I read this in Eliade on yoga, his book on yoga, a classic work on the field, and one of the things he mentioned in passing was that in certain meditative states, it could actually be expressed or manifested in taking the life of a person. In other words, it's the person is not in control. The person is not. You say, well, in the law, you say, well, he didn't have to go for meditation, so we reduce it back and so on. But in the point of the causation factor, there is no cognition blocking the energy. So the energy can kill. Now, before we go on, what is that all about? When I was a kid, way back when, in East Bronx in New York, and it was hot weather like we have today in the summertime, we used to open the pump. As you know, when you're looking for a parking space in New York, it's a pain, because you see from the end of the block there's a beautiful spot, and then as you come by, there's a Johnny pump, which has water in it, and that's used for fire, to fight fires. So every certain number of feet on each block, there's a pump. We used to call them Johnny pump. I don't know if that's true. But there was a pump, and we would take a wrench and open up the pump, and what was a pain in the neck to get a parking space was for kids. A great thing in the summer. We'd take our clothes off, underwear, that's it, and we would go in this water. Now, if you ever saw it, a pump, you open it up, it has a nozzle. Well, phew, boy, that water comes out, it's under pressure. And it's used for firefighting. When the fire guy comes, they unload the thing, hook up the hose, and then in addition to the other fire trucks that have water there and so on, that's how they was putting out a fire. Well, for us kids, whoa, what a machaya! You got undressed, you went in the water and you had to run through fast, because if you stood in that flow, this directed flow, it would push you to the other side of the street. It was powerful. I mean, the water was pushing forth. Now just imagine that the pump was such that it didn't have a nozzle where the water come out like in a straight line, of course. Imagine that it was a putting out of the water in every direction with the same exact force as it come out with the example. Because as in real situation, that's not the case. If you put something in front of it like a screen, or you lessen the water so it lose force, right? Or you put a screen that it would spritz all over the place and you get like an array. And you go into like a shower, and the water would bounce off. But in the beginning, but just imagine the idea of a full force, no change in the power, but change in the sense that there's no direction. Everything is random. Everything is random. Well, you're going to get wet if you go in the water. If you enter that random space, generally speaking, there's no predictability that you're going to be caught. But it's going to be pretty high that indeed, long enough, if you stay there long enough, the random movement of the water eventually will catch you and you'll get wet and you have to go dry off and then come back for your second chance. So, indeed, I used to live in the slums of the East Bronx. The police couldn't stop it because what are they going to do? Every time you just take a wrench and, 10 years old, 8 years old, you take a wrench, open the thing, and that's the end. So they made what they call Play Street. Larry isn't here, he would remember. They had in the United States Play Streets. They had a sign, no cars were allowed in, a sign at one end, a sign at the other, Play Street. And in that Play Street, the police opened the water. But of course, you weren't allowed to do it outside of the Play Street. So we had this thing, Play Street, there were no cars, and we'd have bikes and marbles and whatever you wanted in that street. And one of the things they included was opening up the Johnny Pump and having the water. Okay, so when we talk about life energy, this is a kind of a model or a dugma to get a kind of an intimation or kind of a feeling for what we're talking about. We're talking about a kind of energy which is not purposive, not directive, not organized, random, irrelevant, nothing to do with Tov and Ra, whether it's good or bad, it's just energy functioning this way. So in the Torah system, there is, we mentioned it before, we mentioned it again, and now we see the thing in operation. There are two names for HaKadosh Baruch Hu, two names for God. One is Elokim, one is Yud Kei Vav Kei. Yud Kei Vav Kei is Chayim. If you eat from the Eitz HaChaim, you'll be like Yud Kei Vav Kei, Chayim. And the other one is, if you eat from the Eitz HaDas Tov Ra, you'll be like Elokim. In human terms, the Torah talks in the language of man. In human terms, there's cognition, and there's the rest of the human being. The feelings, the emotions, and the body. So there's two fundamental meanings and packages of meanings underneath these two names. And those names are defined in the second chapter. In the other talk that I gave, we talked about the first chapter being an Elokim chapter with no mention of Hashem. And the big point over there, if you recall, we'll look it up, the big point over there was that the pattern was Yehi, the performative. For HaKadosh Baruch Hu to say the word, let there be, brings it into existence. It says Vayehi, it says Yehi, let there be, Vayehi. For the human being, there ain't no such thing. There has to be something which we then put on it, Yehi. Let this something be a man, a book, a table, a this, a that, a marriage, a korban, whatever it is. So for the human being, there has to be some existence upon which we put the performative Yehi. But for this hypothetical, fictional, or construction, definitional case, when it's Elokim doing it, well, it's like the existence comes automatically with the Yehi. Which, what does that mean for us? It's beyond understanding. We don't deal with it. But the point is that the structure of these first 4 chapters is exactly that. The middle 2 chapters say Hashem Elokim. The first chapter is Elokim without Hashem. And the Kain story, which is our story, is Hashem without Elokim. The converse of the first story. First story is Elokim without Hashem. And now we have the converse, trying to give exemplification, trying to tell the reader, look, I just gave you the names. I said, Nachash said, eat from the Eitz Hadas Tovara, you'll be like Elokim Yodea Tovara. What does that mean? Well, what? It's a new idea, it's a new concept. And by definition or by elimination, if you eat from the Eitz HaChaim, you'll be like Hashem. Well, it gives you the one-liners. But the story now is trying to put some meat on the bones, to give you some little picture to carry with you as you read the material. So, the Kain story is doing just this. So what do we see? We come back now to the opening of the story, and we're going to develop the story along the line where somebody got killed, Kain killed somebody from, or by means of, this package of life energy, which had no intention, no purpose, no motive at all. Again, in ordinary life, there ain't no such thing, because every human being, except the radically mentally ill, or in meditation, even in meditation, the cognition is not completely destroyed or disallowed to work or overcome.
What happened to jealousy?
Well, jealousy was in the other story. We needed a motive, so we interpreted this story, why Kain was down, we interpreted it to fit the picture or the basic set of assumptions. In this orientation, since the text didn't mention jealousy, it's irrelevant. And indeed it is. What's that doing jealousy? Jealousy comes from cognition. Jealousy comes from the mental structuration. Okay, so we're going to show that indeed there's no mental structuration. The best example, Achiv. It said brother. Wait a minute. Wait a minute. What do you mean it was his brother? The narration function, the narrator says Hevel, his brother. But for Kayin, Kayin took Hevel to be a nobody, a no thing, a nothing. That's what the word Hevel means. So the meaning of the name carries enters into the story, just like we're going to do right in this minute when we talk about Kayin. The first line is that Âdem had relations with his wife Chava, and they gave birth to somebody. It didn't say Ben. The usual form is it says they gave birth to a son, and then they give his name. Here there's no word Ben. Again, indicating that maybe we're not talking about individual people having a son or a daughter and so forth. But there's no word Ben in the story. And so, what we have here is Hevel is, whatever's said about Hevel comes from the way Kayin looked at him. The way Kayin took him is what Hevel means in the story. So Kayin took him as a nobody, as a no thing. Or, to take a different kind of a mashal, if you're walking in the street and you pluck a piece of grass, that's not murder. That's destroying, fine, that's not murder. So, wait a minute. What do you mean his brother? For Kayin, he had no brother. Brother comes in from the outside. The narrator is telling you a story, and in the story he's telling you that was his brother. But if you look at the text, and it mentions a number of places Achiv in the same pasuk twice, hinting to the reader that, why don't you look at it? Because when one of the techniques in the biblical stories, when you have a word that it's redundant. He just said brother, so what are you saying it all over again? But sometimes it indicates that it's very worthwhile to look at what's going on. So in the first interpretation we said, am I my brother's keeper? Well, we said, well, look, he's toying with Hashem, who asked the question. Well, here, what do you mean toying? He wasn't toying. He's saying, from my perspective, Kayin, okay, and I'll tell you right away what I am. From my perspective, Hevel is a nothing. So to say that he's my brother, and I have a special relation, is irrelevant. What kind of thing is that? It comes in from cognition. I, Kayin, am Hashem, life energy, random, no purpose, and all the rest. I am Hashem without the slightest bounding by Elohim. That's what I am by definition in the story. Why? How do we see that? Because the first line reads, Chava says, Koniti ish et Hashem. Koniti ish et Hashem. Ish is the male in gender terms. Ish is Âdem, who had an Isha, who was the woman. But in the first line, Koniti ish, I came across, or I am with, or whatever, however you want to translate it, is the problem of Koniti. What exactly does it mean? It doesn't mean somehow so much more created or made. She didn't make anything. She like sort of took it or came across. Okay? Came across something like this. Namely, that there's this being that's coming out of her, of Aim Kol Chai. She's the Aim Kol Chai, she's talked about in the second and third chapter. And she is this package of life energy. And she has somebody who's very much like her in one fundamental respect, that he is all life energy, but no bounding by Elohim. She was Aim Kol Chai. She had life energy, but she was Ezer Kenegdo. She was Isha to Ish. Her life energy was bound in such a way that it had direction. It had purpose. It could serve the good. Whereas life energy per se is neither good nor bad. So when you eliminate the cognition dimension from the story, then indeed he wasn't his brother. He wasn't toying with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. He was telling him the truth. I mean, in the dialogue form. It's not, what do you mean his brother? That's structuration. It's coming from cognition. He doesn't have that. One could even say, in conception, he could be called Av Kol Chai. But, woo, what a difference! Chava, Aim Kol Chai, the energy, the feeling dimension, the bodily dimension, was bound, was directed, and could be directed for creative use and so forth. Ezer Kenegdo, Isha to Âdem. But in Kayin, in that respect, he was like Chava. But in the respect that he had no bound, he was as far from Chava as you could get. Chava said she would accept, the prediction was she'll be ruled by her husband. She'll cleave unto her husband. And she'll be ruled by her husband. Meaning, ruled means here a metaphor for her life energy will relate to his. There'll be basar echad, which we can talk about, and there will be this zivug, this unit of man, ish and isha, where there's a male dimension and a female dimension, and they unite. But each of them has some degree of both. They don't have Hashem or this life energy without complete bound. Kayin has that. So Kayin, she would never want somebody or give anybody praise for being like Kayin. Just like Kayin treated Hevel as a nothing, he treated every woman as a nothing. He treated every being as a nothing. You want to say animal? Okay, because it says they met in the field, basadeh, which could mean that Hevel, for Kayin, he took him as an animal, lying in the sun. And he came and he killed him. There's no murder, he killed the animal. Okay? So even there, we don't call it murder. Of course, it's killing, but it falls under the category of the definition of haram. Okay, so when we look at Chava in the picture, so we see that in one respect, Kain is like Chava. But in another respect, he's way off, way away from Chava. He has no Ezer Kenegdo. He took everything to be random, non-purposive, non-directive, pure in the mashal energy function. He was made up of this energy space, which related to anybody else in the space as a nothing, as being destroyed. So, when we see this picture of Chava, we can at least understand it at this point, and in a way we could add something to it that really is developed in the second part of the story, in chapters 2 and 3. Namely, that yes, she will cleave unto her husband, and she will allow herself to be ruled by him, meaning that allow her energy to be organized in terms of the two of them as a couple and so on, which she would never do with something like somebody like Kain. Kain she's a nobody. So one could say, well, you know, in the mentality of Kain that we were given in the story of being concerned with being a farmer, as a thing from being a shepherd, you know, what does a shepherd do? He keeps the sheep together, he runs after a stray, he sits in the sun most of the time, or in the shade, and plays the flute. I mean, he's a shomer. He's watching over that that nothing goes astray. But he has nothing to do with the production. He has nothing to do with the procreation. He doesn't, you know, when I once was at one of the places here in Israel, and my friend had a farm, and one of his friends there had a horse too, and it gave birth. Well, boy, they warned me. They say, don't come closer than 8 feet, because if you come closer, that horse who just gave birth, and I watched the birth, an amazing thing. It stands up immediately. The horse comes out, and as weak as it is, you know, like you see these in the movies, you know, thin legs and so, but you see it, bing, it stands up. It's unbelievable. Life is a miracle in general, but kal v'chomer, when you see these things happen, it's unbelievable. Just an unbelievable thing. Okay, so in the story, in the Kain story, it says explicitly, Kain waited for the pre-ha'etz, for the fruit to develop, for procreation. He's talking about the grain world, but he's talking about growth, plant development. But Hevel has nothing to do with the procreation. So, I wouldn't say it's in the story, but looking at the two different stances would indicate that Kain would treat a woman like he's treating no better and no worse than he's treating Hevel as a nobody, and what we say a productive animal, a procreative animal. That's what the woman is to Kain. We say in principle nothing, not even that. But in a loosening up of the story, one could look at a woman as pure function. She's an animal. She's a pure animal who has the capacity to give birth. So it's not quite fit the Kain picture, because that comes in from cognition. However, the story somehow fits into this picture. And Hevel was concerned with taking care, watching over. So Hevel would be in the story for Hevel, a woman would not be a nothing. A woman would be a human being. For Kain, the human being is like an animal, a nobody, a nothing. But for Hevel, the woman would be more than a nothing, a something, and indeed more than a procreative animal. A woman is a human being, and the Torah in other contexts, not now, will develop the whole idea, and it starts in the Kain and Abel story, about the relation between the procreative function and the pleasure, and the pleasurability of the having relations. It's a myth, a total myth, to put Torah and even other ancient Near Eastern cultures to put a very strong system on procreation per se, with no pleasure from the whole sexual relation. When the Chumash there in chapter 2 or 3 talks about basar echad, it does not mean to eliminate the fullness of the woman and the fullness of the man, which involves pleasure. So the whole understanding of the sexual starts in this story of chapter 2, and then continues, or at least fits, shall we say, fits this whole kind of a picture of the Hevel picture. Okay, now as I said before, Kayin exemplifies this life energy picture without the slightest bound coming in from Elohim. But in the movement of these chapters, we go from Zohar and Keva, male, female, in the first chapter, and we go into Ish and Isha, man and wife, husband and wife, in the second chapter. And now we come to Kayin, and indeed, since we're dealing with a kind of a construction that doesn't really exist, there is no person that has no cognition. I mean, this is a definitional turn. We're making it fictional to get across the fundamental point about who Kain was, what his whole relationship was. So we move from Zohar and Keva, Ish, Isha, and part of this story is that Hevel and Kayin are part of each person. So Hevel is not an individual person called his brother that's out there, has a body and a body space and so on and so on. Hevel is inside of Kayin. Hevel is the cognitive part of Kayin, which is functioning in zero terms. It's not functioning. Why? Because the female part of Kayin, which is the energy system, is so strong that it disallows the cognitive to come through, to put bounds on it. And that's exactly what the first pasuk says. Kaniti ish et Hashem. Ish is the male. Ish is the cognitive component. Ish is Âdem. And it says, Kaniti ish et Hashem. Now, it does not mean that she had relations with Hashem. It says she had relations with Âdem, her husband. And they said, with the help of Hashem. There's no help. What kind of help? It's Hashem in that pasuk. Et Hashem, Ish et Hashem, is a property, is a characteristic of Kain. In other words, that's the female energy part of Kain, which went together with Ish, the male part of Kain, which was disallowed to function in Kain because of the tremendous power of the Hashem component in Kain. So that the story moves out of the literal into the allegorical, and says in effect that each person has both a Kayin dimension and a Hevel dimension. Now, you shouldn't jump right away and say, well, look, you're going out of the bound. The Rambam, for example, as those who study the Rambam, you understand, the Rambam took as allegorical the first story of Âdem Rishon and Chava and the Nachash, and defined those terms as construction terms in terms of the Greek conceptions of the understanding, of the cognition, and the emotions, the imagination, and the senses. And the Rambam, if you read Mordevuchim, he gives you an allegorical interpretation of the text in terms of these Greek categories. Now, I'm very far away from interpretation in terms of Greek categories. We move much past that. However, to say that at this point in the Kain story, it's not unreasonable to say, wait a minute, we went from Zohar and Kema, Ish, Ishto, now we come to the individual person who has a male and a female component. That's a male has a dominant male component and a less dominant female component, and vice versa. And each human being has a combination of the two, and the whole notion is the dominance. In the Kabbalah and systematic Kabbalah, this is a given in all of the Kabbalah material about how we define the different personages in the text and the characteristics of the human being. There's a female side and a male side, and they're interpreted in terms of function and dominance. What's dominant makes you a man. What's dominant makes you a female. And in the relation of the two, there's a kind of a synergy between the male in one and the female in the other, and that leads to a number of side effects which build up the richness of the man-woman relationship in the Torah system. That's not for now, for some other time. But the basic idea is that in function terms, we can now transpose the whole story into each individual person and talk about the Kayin dimension of the person and the Hevel dimension of the person. Coming from the first pasuk, Kaniti Ish et Hashem, with this life energy component. Ish is the male component with the going together. Et here means with, together with. Okay. So there are a few things that remain. We showed so far that by having as a transition point the meaning of Harag, which opens up the whole picture to the whole second development, which fits the language, fits the picture, fits this notion of Echad, and so on and so on. And indeed, the Torah talks in the language of man. We're talking about how cognition, the cognitive dimension of the human being, is blocked by something else, by energy, by feelings, and anybody who works in counseling, right, and anybody who works with people, and indeed anybody who reflects on their own human relationships is dealing as one of the fundaments the relation between the cognitive dimension in you and in your spouse and vice versa, and the non-cognitive dimension, and the harmony and disharmony that arises, and so on and so on and so on and so on. How to get the proper balance between the two is the goal of the counseling. I mean, like Freud said, you can't have a cup of coffee in Western civilization without some anxiety and tension and so forth. But the Torah system is saying, well, it's true. That seems to be the case. And in this century, we are certainly eating the daisa. But on the other hand, one can overcome. One can achieve basar echad with spouse. One can achieve this balance between the male-female in you as a man and in somebody as a woman, and so forth. So the system is not a kind of a hopeless system. On the other side, It's building up the greatness of the system with these components that I put in. Okay, so one question remains. We talked about this genealogy in the Kain story. He was banned to Nod to build up and make it civil, make it civilized, and there were 3 or 4 stages in that process in this chapter 4 on Kain. But this chapter is followed immediately by the chapter 5, which is the full genealogy of Âdem. It says this is the genealogy of Âdem. It calls it a sefer. The language is this is chapter 5, pasuk 1. Zeh sefer toldot Âdem. The first member toldot we talked about was the sefer toldot Shemayim V'aretz. Toldot does not mean births, it means developments. These are the developments, the things that moved, that came out of one stage leading to another, the developmental process. So it says, Zeh sefer toldot Âdem. So there was a book which was probably cross-cultural. There was a book, we don't have it maybe, but there was a book within which there was a genealogy that started with Âdem, Bara, in the time that he was created, and it refers in the language, you'll see it in the words, it refers back to the creation story and to the chapter 2, it uses the same words, V'hi bara, and so on. You'll see the linkage very clearly in the words. And Zohar and Kabil created them, and so on and so on and so on. And then Âdem had lived a certain number of years, and he gave birth to Shet. Well, he gave birth to Shet, but what happened to Kain? He gave birth to Shet, and Shet gave birth to Shet gave birth to Enosh. Okay? Okay? So the question is, in this sefer, probably cross-cultural, there's no mention of Kain. Now, that's odd. I would like to say, well, of course, why should there be a mention of Kain if it's a construction? But it's presented as an exemplification. Indeed, it is an allegory. I mean, you can't get away from it because it doesn't exist. I mean, there is no such thing. But it would be nice to say that, but you can't say that. It's too much of a speculation. But I thought that this would be a good thing. Yeah, it doesn't mention Kain in this genealogy, which is cross-cultural. What am I looking for? And especially, where are we? Chapter 4, chapter 2, chapter 3. Here we are. Okay, so I thought that the fact that it wasn't mentioned was sort of another giving a chizuk to this whole understanding package that I'm presenting in terms of the story. It's nothing to do with murder, it has to do with killing that's coming from this type of a state, and it's really setting forth a teaching about Hashem and Elokim. That's the subject, what we're talking about. Just like the first chapter is giving you insight into Elokim. Now it's giving you insight into Hashem. That's far away from the topic of murder. We're not talking about murder. We're not talking about that at all. That's a mundane topic compared to what we're talking about. We're talking about the basics of the Torah system in the Chumash. Why? Because each place after chapters 2 and 3, it says Hashem or Elokim, but not Hashem Elokim. It doesn't exist except for that one exception. So it only exists in the second chapter, which is giving you the definition. So in the Torah system, Hashem cannot be separated from Elokim, and vice versa. But there's a dominance. In one story, Hashem is the dominant part. And in another story, Elokim is the dominant part. And I, in the Perush, went through each place in Chumash where it says Hashem, 1,800 places, and 250 places where it says Elokim, and showed why it says, respectively, one or the other, and in those places where it switches from one to the other, why it switches. You know, that was left over for Atchalta the Gula and our time for somebody to come and do something as simple but as so much needed to understand the text. That when it says Hashem, it means Hashem Elokim with a dominance on Hashem. When it says Elokim, it means Elokim as Hashem Elokim with a dominance on Elokim. And so that's the way to read the Chumash. How can you understand the text if you bypass the difference, the fundamental difference between Hashem and Elokim that's giving you in these four first chapters? So that's really important. I mean, killing is important, of course. It goes without saying. One of the Aseret HaDibrot, but how to read the text? What does it help you read the text? When it's talking about killing, okay, so you can use Retzach, use Harag, use Hika, use synonymous words, but this is organizational. This is the whole text. So that's what the topic is. The topic of those first four chapters is how to read the book, how to read the text. It's giving you the clues how to read the text. Okay, so I thought, well, Kain would be a chizuk. But as I went through the material and I read this Fabre d'Alave, my biblical dictionary, which we'll talk about some other time in detail, what this is. This is a book on biblical Hebrew, published in 1810 by a Frenchman who dealt with the discovery of the roots of the language. And in his book, he has a Perush, a commentary on the first 10 chapters, in which he shows, in many of them, on the one hand, the profundity of the text, but on the other hand, how the text got misinterpreted, especially after it was translated into Greek and Latin by Jerome, and meanings came down, which have entered the Jewish tradition as well. Like in the Targum, if you look in the Targum, you'll see it says, and it doesn't say Lo Tirtzach, the Katle. Katle in Aramaic has a kind of a connotation of punishment. So it's closer to Retzach, to murder. And I'm sure I looked up the Greek, but I couldn't get it clear. But if you look at the translations and the material, you'll see that all of a sudden what's come down as the meaning of the story has bypassed this whole business. Like I said a number of times, you could ask somebody in the street or in the Torah and go to shul, where's the first place it says Hashem in the Chumash? They'll tell you right away in the second chapter. It says Hashem Elokim. But the first place is in the Kain story, because the other, that's a two-part name and not Hashem by itself. So this is so fundamental to the basic story. So I thought, well, that Kain is not mentioned is a kind of a chizuk. But it's not the case. As you look, he makes a footnote here that the same allegory of Kayin and Hevel is found in the Hindus under the name of Mahu Diva and so forth. And in one of his footnotes, he says, look, this was a cross-cultural story. Just like Noah and the flood, which we'll come to some other time, was a cross-cultural story, which has in it fundamental components. Now, of course, I didn't even know if it's available, but I didn't check it. I don't know exactly what the differences are, but there's work for scholarship to, if it's available, to catch the story. What are the differences between the Kain and Hevel story in our text and the Kain and Hevel story in the Hindu text? And he talks about a little later how the Greeks interpreted Saturn, use the word for Kain and so on, and later on, and even talked about the Arab tradition. So that it's cross-cultural and certainly can't be used as a chizuk. The question remains for me why it's not in there, because there is a Kain genealogy. Some of the names often are the same, like Lemach and so on, and other names are not the same. So questions about whether they're the same name, with a different spelling. All these questions for me remain open. I have no answer to consolidate and link up the two genealogies. One follows the other. One is the end, 6 psukim from in chapter 4 of the Kain story, links up with the full genealogy of socio-cultural characteristics given in the 5th chapter. Okay, I think that covers the basic point for tonight. The basic point was to show that Kain killed somebody, he killed Hevel, but it's not necessarily murder. Indeed, when you look and take apart the story the way I try to do this evening, you see that it can reasonably carry a different interpretation completely, with much more significance, much more importance than the story about the first murder. And I try to show it by these different points that I put in the text. In the human terms, the point that comes out is indeed that each person has a male and a female dimension, and that's where we're going to go as we start to deal with people in the Chumash, personages in the Chumash. We not only have the Hashem Elokim language, but we see in the way the context works on particular people, what's operating. Is the cognitive operating? Is the cognition moving? Is the cognition includes justification, giving reasons why something. So if the text wants to point out that something happened, but it was justified, like somebody giving birth, didn't have a long time, and then gave birth. If it wants to say it was justified, that person should have given birth. It's an answer to a why question. If they waited so long and so on, then it could be it's an Elokim story, because Elokim carries the justification. If it's the fact is carried by Hashem in the text. So there's significant differences between cognitive and non-cognitive, the feeling dimension. In the Korbanot books about Vayikra, it's all Hashem. There are about 6 or 7 places where it says Elokim. Most of the time it's Hashem, because we're dealing with the Korban system, which has to do with energy and so on and so on, which we'll talk about some other time. The point being that we have not only the completion of the definitions of Hashem and Elokim in the text, but by virtue of each person being male-dominated or female-dominated, gives you another entree into any of the stories to ask yourself, what's operating in the person, aside from the clues that we get from the use of Hashem and Elokim in the story. Okay, that's enough for tonight. Can't have murder without a motive. So what's the motive? Well, it happens to be that the story goes, it has an opening pasuk about Chava and Âdem, who gave birth to Kayin. We'll come back to that first pasuk. And then right after that it says a little story about Kain was a farmer and Hevel was a shepherd. Okay? And they each brought offerings called a mincha. Not important for the moment what it is. We'll talk about it a little bit later. But each one of them brought an offering to Hashem. Okay. And the next pasuk says that Hevel's was accepted and Kain's was not accepted. No reason is given. There's no reason in the text why one is accepted and the other isn't. There have been speculations about the quality of the korban, or the quality of the offering, that when you're dealing with the grain offering, which is mincha, the offering that they gave, that's at a lower order than if you give an animal, or you give a cow, or something like that, or a sheep. But what does that have to do with anything? If the guy's a farmer, he does, and not a shepherd, so he gives the best of his crop. And the pasuk emphasizes in the text, you can read it for yourself. After the pre-hadamah, the fruit of his toil and labor, came to an end where he had to harvest, he gave the best, whatever it is. Okay. So, motive. So the pasuk right after the few lines on the story says to Hashem, so we'd like to dedicate this year to Dr. Shweka and Chana, my daughter, on the birth of a newborn. Well, if it's a birth, it's a newborn.
You need this.
Boy.
You need this.
Okay. Baruch Hashem, Yom Yom. Okay, now we come to this very, very interesting and difficult story. Short, 26 psukim, but very, very difficult to understand. In going over the commentary in Ferush that I wrote, it was already 15, 20 years ago, and going it over now, I was at the Kayin and Hevel section, and indeed I changed the title. Instead of saying Kayin and Hevel, that's what I said before, I changed it to Kayin / Hevel. And as this talk progresses, you will see why I did that. When you see why I did that, you understand the whole thrust of this talk. So I changed it from Kayin and Hevel to Kayin / Hevel. Okay, now in general, the question is, the fact is, in the story, Kain kills Habil. The question is, how are we to understand the word, the killing? What does killing mean? Now, in English usage, in normal circumstance, like we're not talking about a war or something like that, when we say kill, we mean murder. That's the colloquial usage of the language. If you say kill without any explanation, it generally carries the notion of murdering somebody. Okay. We're not interested now in the law, which deals with first and second degree and so on, and manslaughter and different stages or subtleties in the law. However, in English it means to kill in the sense of murder. But in this story, that's one of the questions. He killed, but is the killing murder or not? So therefore, one has to be very careful on the language one uses. So I use the word destroy. Instead of saying killed, I use the word destroyed. Or the usual word they talk about here is slew. He slew him. S-L-E-W. Okay. Now, what's interesting is we're going on the assumption Kain killed Hevel, and the general opinion has been for the longest time that this was murder. Murder. Oh, not any other type of killing, whatever there is. Even for some people, the only other type of killing there is really in a war. But as we'll see later, there are other types which can be carried by the same word. But lo and behold, the word that's used in the text is harag. Haragta. He met Kain. He said something. We'll talk about that later. And he went out to meet. He rose up and met Habil in the field, and he killed him. Vayar Gehu, and he killed him. So the first question is, the word for murder in Hebrew, biblical Hebrew, is ratzeach. So usually the rule is in Hebrew, in biblical Hebrew, that when you introduce a topic and you introduce the language of that topic, usually there's some explanation on the spot and not at a later point. That's the way the thing works. If you introduce a word, for example, that wasn't used before, then there'll be the next sentence will give you some intimation of what the word it means. Okay, so the first question is, why doesn't it say retzach? That's the word for murder. Okay. The answer is, that the term Retzach is a legal term. The first place it occurs is in the Aseret HaDibrot, the Ten Commandments. We're in Breshit, the beginning. And in Noah's story, in one of the chapters, it says that you shouldn't kill, he'll kill somebody, we have to give him capital punishment. So, in places other than a legal context, the first being Aseret HaDibrot in the middle of Shemot, the word Retzach is not used. The word Harag is the basic term. Okay? So that answers the question here. This is not a legal context. It's not a legal context. So even though it's the first time that we have this type of an event, this type of an action of murdering, which could be reasonable cause for exception to the general rule, that is, even though this is not a legal context, it should, as the first, carry the notion of Retzach. Okay, we bypassed that, but the basic point is that it's carried by the word Harag. Okay? Now, the next, you watch any TV program? What's the motive? We got all the forensics now, we got all these TV programs showing you all the forensics, and we're searching for motive. You test the Kayin, if you will do good, you'll be okay. But meaning that somehow there was something wrong with Kain's korban. From the point of view of Hashem telling him, look, if you'll do good, you'll improve, you'll be okay. So it's implied from that there was something wrong with Kain's korban, even though the text doesn't say anything. Okay, so what's the motive? Oh, we got a motive. Jealousy. Kain was jealous of Hevel, whose korban or his offering was accepted, and his wasn't. So the question, or the assumption, one, that there was murder, and two, that murder needs a motive, gave a thrust, an intimation as to the meaning of that story in there about one being a shepherd and one being a farmer. In other words, that now took on a meaningfulness in terms of the overall point that's being built up. That was the motive. The motive was jealousy. And how do we know? Because the word for jealousy is kin'ah, and Kain's name has the same letters, and so, by association, one could say it's not unreasonable that Kain's name includes this jealousy, and indeed jealousy was the motive for killing him, even though it's not mentioned in the text. So it's inferred from the way we're setting up the development of the story. Okay.
That's the computer?
I don't know what that is. In any event, there's no jealousy,